Good evening. Welcome to Reflections on East Granby. My name is Mike Malloy, and I'll be your host this evening. Our guest tonight is David Kilbon, a 32-year resident of East Granby. Moved to East Granby in 1979, and he's going to share his story and observations with us tonight. Good evening, David.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be here.
Good to see you. Okay, so we start out where we do with everybody at the important part of your birth, a crucial date in your life, and we'll start there. Where were you born, Dave?
I was born in Mineola, New York.
Okay.
It's in Nassau County, just outside of Queens.
Okay, so just outside the city.
Yep.
Yeah. And how old were you when you, how long did you live there?
We lived in the Floral Park, actually, which was the sort of halfway between Mineola and the Queens boundary. We lived there for 3 years, and then my dad was reassigned to Paris. He was working for the New York Herald Tribune at the time as a reporter.
Oh.
And he was reassigned to Paris, so we moved to Paris for a year. That was in 1949, so it was post-war Reconstruction, and we were a whole lot better off than most of the locals. So at the time, we had a very interesting and rich life at the time. We were there for about a year, and then he moved, he changed jobs. He went to work for the U.S. Information Agency as a public relations officer for the Marshall Plan. And we lived in The Hague in Holland for 2 years.
Okay. So what did he actually do? What did he do in Paris as a job, and what did he do in The Hague?
He was an economic editor for the international edition of the Herald Tribune.
A writer. Continued.
He was a writer at the time, mostly on economic issues.
Okay.
Pretty much centered in Paris and the local area there.
Was that his specialty? Was that something, or was he just a writer that found a specialty?
No, he was a newspaper man from before the war. He graduated from college. He went to Wesleyan here in Connecticut, and he graduated from college with a degree in, I guess, English or journalism.
Okay.
And he worked for the Herald Tribune for a couple of years before the war. And then in 1942, he volunteered, went into the service, served in Europe.
Okay.
And then after he was discharged in the beginning of the end of 1945, beginning of 1946, he went back to work for the Tribune.
Okay.
And he covered the UN for a little while in its beginnings. They were in Lake Success, which is outside New York City at that point, so that's why we settled in Floral Park.
So they didn't have their big complex. It was all outside the city.
No big complex.
Okay.
They were. I'm not quite sure exactly what they were in, but they were in some kind of existing structures they were occupying. So he had been a writer, and then he worked for them for another 3 years before he got the assignment in Paris.
Okay. Now, so you were old enough when you first went to Paris that you probably have some impression or some memory from there. Is there anything you could?
I do. We lived in a suburban area in a large house with a big garden, and the house was sort of falling apart. The garden was beautiful.
Okay.
What I can remember most about it were the folks that we interacted with. We had a gardener who came with the place. We were renting it.
Okay.
And the gardener spoke no English, and of course, I was barely speaking English myself.
Right.
But we communicated somehow. He was very fond of children, and he left a big impression on me then. But as far as the house was concerned, I can remember that when you walked up the stairs, you could see the outdoors through a crack in the wall.
Oh,
so
really?
That tells you how well built the house was.
So it was in need of some repair.
It was in need of a lot of repair.
Okay, so other than that, in Paris, it was a big, thriving metropolis, so it wasn't,
it was
a rebuilding metropolis.
Yeah, it wasn't so much thriving, I suppose.
Yeah,
but my memories of the city are almost non-existent because as a 3-year-old, we didn't venture out a whole lot.
Yeah, and the memories would be a little foggy anyway. Yeah. Okay, so at 4, you went to The Hague.
4, we went to The Hague. We lived up there, as I said, for a couple of years.
Okay.
And I began school there. I was going to school at an English school. It was a private school run by English. Literally England English.
So you started at what, 5 years old?
Started at 5 years old in what I guess would be the equivalent of a kindergarten.
Right.
Most of my classmates were not American, but they were English speakers sort of as a second language. I remember we had good friends, my sister and I, she's 2 years older than I, so she was in an upper grade. But we were very good friends with a couple of kids from Norway. Other people from other parts of the diplomatic community who weren't in the Dutch public school system.
So you had quite an early cosmopolitan experience there as a young. Yeah. I mean, not that you would. Yeah. As a child at that age, they're your friends.
Yeah, I mean, it just sort of happens.
Any different. Yeah,
just sort of happens. And I think it was interesting as I look back on it now. It was interesting for me because not everybody lived like we do.
Right.
And that was an object lesson very early on, that not everybody speaks English, not everybody lives as we do. The Dutch people were extremely warm and they loved children.
Right.
So it was a great ride for me and my sister as kids. You know, we had a terrific life.
Now, was English the diplomatic language of the day? So you had a lot of interaction in English, or did you pick up anything in the other languages?
I picked up probably, ironically, more French than Dutch, because Dutch was a very hard language to learn in the sense that for most Dutch people, English was a second language.
Okay.
And again, I was going to a school where English was the language that everything was taught in.
Right.
You know, that was the common language that we had as students.
So the Dutch would defer to English more than the French would.
Well, I remember my mother saying that she and my dad tried to take Dutch lessons at one point, and I remember her being frustrated because she'd walk into a butcher shop, say, and in very fractured Dutch that she'd learned a couple of days before, she would order something, and the butcher, in perfect English, would turn to her and say, "Oh, Mrs. Kilbon, you want such and such."
It's not real, yeah.
So she never really, you know, she was trying to be, you know, to blend in, if you will, but
she tried.
She tried and it didn't work.
Yeah, if there's a highway and a back road, you usually take the highway.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you had, you actually went to school till you were 6 there, you said, right?
Left. I turned 6 on the ship back to the States. So really during the time that I was 5.
Okay, so your family's moving back to the United States. What was the reasoning for that? Was it?
Well, the Marshall Plan had ended.
Okay,
really,
so the money,
the money had dried up, and so Dad got a job with the U.S. Information Agency in Washington D.C.
Okay, so he stayed within the diplomatic circle. Yeah. Okay, so you went back to the United States on a ship.
On a ship,
you didn't fly much in those days.
Not with luggage.
No,
and at that point we had a dog too, so it would have been real hard to come back.
Moving a family. So it was yourself, your mom, your dad, and your sister?
Yes.
Okay. So you come back to the United States and you're living in D.C.
Lived in D.C.
Probably start to have more vivid memories at this point.
It was. I went to school at the local school, walked to school up and over a hill. I can remember that, and we lived in, again, a suburban community called Chevy Chase, which is just outside the district boundaries.
Okay.
A lot of the places that I remember are still there. When I go back to D.C., I can still spot things that I remember even from 6 or 7 years old.
Okay.
Started first grade there.
Yeah, that was a fairly developed area even then.
Yeah,
I mean,
very much
suburbia kind of spread out from there into Virginia. So you went to school there for till how old?
Well, we only lived there about 6 months.
Okay, so that was a short span.
So I was there I was in school for probably, maybe half a year.
Okay. Now, so from there you went to?
We moved to Westport, Connecticut.
Okay.
Dad got a job in New York City.
So you did bounce around quite a bit.
I bounced around,
yeah. Okay.
And he commuted from Westport, and we lived there for just over a year.
And he was still working as a writer?
At this point, he was working for RCA, but again as a writer in public relations.
Okay.
So he was.
Seemed like there were a lot more jobs in that public relations writing jobs back then. I don't know if it's.
Well, I'm not sure that there are any fewer now. I think they tend to be maybe differently cast.
And they're probably working at agencies. It's more it's more of something you farm out, isn't having in-house. But, okay, so you're in Westport, and how long were you there?
There about a year, a little over a year, maybe a year and a half, and then we moved to Princeton, New Jersey.
Okay.
Which is really where I feel like I grew up, because we lived there for 10 years.
And that's where the headquarters is that where?
No, actually RCA was at that point was in New York City.
It was, okay.
And but they had a big laboratory facility in Princeton, which is why we moved down there.
So that was a big campus for them.
Yeah.
Okay, what are your memories of? So that was really where you grew up.
Yeah.
I can. What are your memories of that area?
Well, it's geographically it's midway between New York and Philadelphia, and all of the kids that I grew up with had parents that either worked for the university or some related operation in Princeton.
Yeah.
Or they
real college town.
It's dominated by the college.
Yeah.
Also large research parks, things that sort of centered around the university that were university affiliated, but not part of the teaching facility, if you will, heavy research operations.
Did RCA draw off that for their technology? Is that why they?
They drew off some of it. I think probably they centered their research center there primarily because it was between a large manufacturing facility they had outside Philadelphia and their corporate headquarters in New York. And so I think that's what made it an appropriate place for them. They probably also, in a practical perspective, they could probably afford the land at the time they bought it.
Right.
And built on that campus.
Now, growing up there, was that a fairly suburban experience, or was it a more diverse group that you lived with?
It's typically suburban, but it's flavored by being a university community. And at that point, Princeton was an all-male school and had about 3,000 students. So the university itself wasn't so much what we high school kids or grade school and high school kids remember as just the having some of the cultural and athletic facilities that a university brings.
Okay, so this would be through the 50s into the early 60s?
Through the 50s, I was there until 1964.
Okay, so you lived basically the 50s American kind of suburban.
It was very much the Ozzie and Harriet kind of lifestyle.
Right, yeah, I bet, yeah. So any other reflections on that period of your life that you want to share? I mean, is there anything,
Just
the schooling? Or?
I mean, it was we were very fortunate in the sense that the school system in Princeton absorbed an awful lot of the university's parents' kids.
Okay.
And so it was it made the school system very challenging and a good system. I think they gave us a very strong education, which was helpful. It was also great to live in a university community where you could go to basketball games, you could there were plays, you could a lot of the touring companies that went through New York also stopped in Princeton.
It was a cultural hub.
So it was, it offered a lot. And the fact that as I got older, the fact that it was close to New York was a draw.
Right.
Because I could go up to New York after school, and spend some time there and come back. Not always something my parents were excited about.
Yeah, right. They got nervous, but you had fun.
Yeah.
That's pretty
had
standard,
a great time,
right?
yeah.
Not much changes. So you had, how old were you? So you would have been 18? Did you graduate there?
Graduated from high school there.
Okay.
And then went to college from there.
And where did you go to school?
Went to Cornell in Ithaca, New York.
Okay.
And it was another interesting experience. I mean, it was jumping from a place where I had done very well in high school to a place where everybody around me had done very well in high school.
More challenging
very much so.
environment.
Very much so.
What degree did you pursue there?
I got a bachelor's in economics.
Okay. And was that your chosen? Well, that's interesting because your dad wrote when you were young. But what was the draw there? What did you think you were going to?
Well, actually, the draw for economics was the fact that there were several things that I wanted to pursue in the liberal arts area. I was most interested in politics, in economics, some history, and of the three that interested me, economics required the fewest courses to graduate with a degree in economics, so I had more time to take other courses.
Probably the most jobs at the end that were waiting.
Well, to some extent, yeah. It was, when I got out of school, the job market was remarkably different from the way that it was very soon after that, in the sense that there were lots of jobs available.
What year would you
68.
graduate? So 68, you got your degree in economics?
Yeah.
Okay.
And there were a lot of jobs available, so finding a job was not a difficult thing.
That was a boom economy.
It was a terrific economy.
Yeah.
So I mean, it was fueled by the war in Vietnam, so you could argue that it wasn't a good boom, but it was a booming economy.
Sometimes the reasons aren't always the best. Anyway, so you graduate college, and where did you get your first job?
Right here. Well, not in East Granby.
Okay. GCTV?
No, not GCTV. No, I got it. I went to work for the Connecticut General Life Insurance Company, which was in Bloomfield.
And what was your actual position?
I think I was a management trainee, was what they called it.
All right.
They had a sort of a loose training program that they absorbed people into, and so that's what brought me to.
Well, there's a lot there. Economics is a big field. What was your direction?
Really, economic history more than anything else. But when you get an undergraduate degree in economics, there's not a tremendous specialization at that point.
It's generic.
It would be you'd be moving on to something else, which I did not do. I did not go to grad school.
Okay.
But you take sort of a broad range of courses, and then you have certain courses beyond that you can take. And I tended to lean toward the economic history side of things.
How do you get a job with that sort of focus at an insurance company? What was your position? What were they using you to do?
Well, the management trainee kind of job was, the idea was to circulate you through parts of the company and get you acclimated to what they did as a business.
Right.
So I was involved in writing contracts. This was on what was then called group insurance, is now called employee benefits.
Okay.
But I was writing contracts. I was handling premium collection administration, employee enrollment, things like that, working out of the home office, but working with companies in the field that bought our product.
Okay, so as you were going to be in management, or the goal was for you to be a manager,
Right.
they just gave you the broad experience.
Right.
Okay, so there really wasn't. You were going to be managing people.
Not initially.
No. Okay.
No.
But initially they placed you in a lot of different positions to experience what you would be managing, hopefully later.
Yep.
Is that fair?
That's the concept.
Okay, right. It was. I think it was more of a corporate philosophy back then, where they actually did that more. Now
Yes.
it kind of happens a little more randomly, I think.
Well, I think the company was very interested in having as broad a ranging workforce as they could find, in the sense that they wanted the people they brought in to get a broad sense of what different parts of the company do and how they operate and what the core principles are.
I think the jobs are so much more transient now that they don't have time to develop that as much.
That's true.
I think they often draw from other companies to get the people that would be able to do, or there's a lot more movement. Okay, so you're there. How long were you there?
I worked for Connecticut General, which became Cigna, for 23 years in total.
Okay, so that was your career.
So that was my career.
Out of college, you had a career. Great. So where did you live in Connecticut when you first moved to Connecticut?
Well, I first moved to Connecticut, lived in Hartford for a year, and then moved to Simsbury, then Unionville, and then Terriffill, and then West Hartford, and Bloomfield, and then East Granby.
How many places have you lived? No, I'm just kidding. Well, East Granby we can stop because you've been there for.
That was the end of the line. Yeah.
Okay, so you kind of followed the family tradition for the first part of your post graduate experience. So you moved. So it'd be difficult to touch on all of those. Any of those you have any impact on you, or to really?
Not overwhelmingly. I mean, it was always
so.
being west of the river. It was the goal, because it was easier to commute to the job in Bloomfield.
Okay.
So
let me just back up 1 second. What drew you to? Was it just the job that brought you here, or did you have any other desire to live in this area, or you out of college?
Just the job.
Just the job.
Yeah.
So you went on a kind of a job search upon graduation and found.
Actually, before graduation, because at that point companies were actively recruiting on college campuses. And so I had several opportunities in different parts of the country, and this one seemed to be the best. So came to Connecticut.
In New Jersey, where you grew up, it's not much different. I mean, culturally, there was. Well, you were in Princeton, so that would have been different.
Yeah, I mean, and it is a little different. I mean, I think if you center around New York City, if you moved south and west from here, you'd find more of a sort of a common culture around New York City. But here it's enough removed so you actually sort of feel like you're in the gravitational pull of Boston as well as New York, and there is an identity here that's not the New York identity.
And it was kind of a boom development time, so there was a lot of changes going on here, but it was more rural at the time. Some of the areas that you described.
Well, certainly East Granby was a lot more rural at the time. Yeah.
So you moved to East Granby in 1979, and you had what was the draw? Well, okay, this is where it focuses on East Granby. So I'm going to ask you the question that I ask everybody: what was your first impression of the town of East Granby when you came in, if you remember? I mean, it's.
When I first moved in, or when I first became aware of East Granby?
Well, you bounced around quite a bit. So then you're looking for a house? Is that?
Yeah. Looking for a house. We knew folks who lived in East Granby. East Granby was a popular home for a lot of people who worked at Cigna, or CG at the time. And so we'd come to know quite a few people there, and who lived here in East Granby and worked at CG.
And they spoke
highly of the town. And so when I was looking for a place, this seemed a logical one, and we were looking at houses in the whole area. We found a house we really liked, the house we're still in, and moved here.
Which is on
Heather Lane.
Heather Lane, right on the corner. So you're looking around. Was there any other than the personal references that you got about the town? Was there any other thing that struck you when you came to?
The fact, I think the impressive thing about East Granby is that it's small. Certainly it was smaller then than it is now, but it's still a small town. And it's a real sense we had a real sense of community. among the folks that we ran into. And that was really, I think, what was most attractive about it. That's certainly what people who lived here spoke about when we talked to them about looking at various parts of this area.
So it echoed with the refrain you were hearing. I mean,
Yeah.
You felt what they were telling you it was. Okay. It was as you moved into your house and you got settled in, and you fairly quickly got involved with civic organizations and politics and stuff. So why don't we touch on that?
Okay. I've probably been here a little over a year, maybe 2 years, and
Didn't wait too long.
Didn't wait too long, no. And got involved initially with getting appointed to commissions. Got involved with the Insurance Commission, which was disbanded very quickly after I got onto it.
Let me just stop you right there for a second, because people move into a town. They first get settled in, and what was the connection that enabled you to? Did you know somebody? Were you involved? Did you just register in a party? How did that happen?
Registered in a party, and got a welcome letter from the town committee.
Okay.
And so I said, well, this sounds interesting. So I attended a couple of town committee meetings.
Okay.
And then got interested in that, and at that point, someone on the town committee said, we're certainly looking for people who would be interested in volunteering. Would you be interested in being on, in this case, the Insurance Commission?
So you were appointed?
So I said, sure. Yes, it was an appointed commission.
Who was the first selectman at the time?
First selectman at that point was Frank Rothhammer.
Okay.
And Frank had served, I'm trying to remember how long Frank did serve, but he served quite a few years. He was sort of a constant presence in East Granby at that point.
Okay.
And so Frank was, as I said, was the first selectman. I was appointed to the Insurance Commission first. After that, disbanded, wound up on the Economic Development Commission for a while. Appointed again. Ran for the Board of Finance and lost.
Okay.
And then 2 years later ran for the Board of Finance and won.
Okay.
And then served for 10 years on the Board of Finance before I ran for first selectman.
And in 1995, you were elected first selectman. Is that your first run as first selectman?
That was my first run as first selectman,
okay.
Yes.
So you had a pretty, and then you were first selectman for
12 years.
12 years. So.
And now back on Board of Finance.
We could probably do a whole show just on that span, because you've had quite a few experience just in the town and in the changes that have occurred. So, okay, so getting back to when you first got involved, what was your impression of the way things were handled at that point? I mean, it was most of the appointments that you'll get like that are because you've gotten involved and somebody saw that you were willing to participate, and they saw a particular skill set in yourself, which was economics, and you got appointed to the Insurance Commission. What was your first impression of a commission? Was it what you expected, or was it?
It was probably less formal than I had expected it to be.
Okay.
The Insurance Commission at that point, the role of the Insurance Commission, since it doesn't exist anymore, I should probably explain what we were supposed to do.
That's a big
was
great
to
story.
advise the first selectman on choices of property casualty insurance, life insurance for employees, and so forth.
Interesting.
And our role really was fairly limited in the sense that those are the things today you would use you'd hire a broker to do.
Right.
Basically, you would hire an advisor, somebody who's practiced.
So you were actually an independent consulting commission to advise the Board of Selectmen on which insurance to buy?
Right.
Basically? Interesting.
Basically, yes.
Yeah, wow.
That was our role. And not necessarily, which carrier to go with.
Yeah.
But plan design, what kinds of things would be logical to insure, and what levels of insurance or limits of coverage you'd look for.
Interesting.
So that was our role initially. And I think what happened was that the insurance industry got sophisticated enough so it was very tough for a board of volunteers who had some exposure to insurance, but not,
Right.
no terrific expertise, to be functioning in that role.
Right.
And so
You needed a professional.
You really
Somebody
needed to bring somebody on board who had his finger on the pulse of the market and
Yeah.
could figure out how to bid these things out properly. And
That's been the evolution of so many things in town government, hasn't it?
It has.
Where you see that the expertise level just continues to increase.
well, I think in many respects, life has become more complicated and more sophisticated than it used to be. I mean, if you go back several first selectmen before Frank. You had first selectmen who were part-timers,
Right.
who were doing things like running the plow trucks in the winter,
Right.
things like this. And we've just evolved to the point where it takes not necessarily a terrific expertise so much as the time and energy to look into things,
Right.
or to bring someone on board who has the expertise that you need.
It's like a big family farm at one point.
In many respects. I mean,
and we wore
yeah.
a lot of different hats,
Yeah.
in other words. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I think the risk when you make a mistake is increased exponentially. So that there's that aspect of it too.
In a lot of respects, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So did you have fun? You must have.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a positive experience.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So then you went to the Economic Development Commission. you
Yes.
said? And what did that look like in that day? What was your? Is it similar to what they do today, or was
I think it's more active today.
Okay.
I think that to a great extent, the Economic Development Commission's functions depend a lot on the way in which the Commission wants to operate itself. It can
Okay.
be very active, it can be somewhat passive.
Right.
When I was on the Economic Development Commission, it tended to be fairly passive. Those were also boom times,
Right.
in the sense that the grand list was growing quite quickly without having to do a whole lot.
Right.
That's when the industrial area on Route 20 to the east side of town was actually beginning to get populated.
Okay.
And so you were seeing companies come in and growth in that era that was fairly robust compared to what you see today.
So you were more of a scorekeeper than a cheerleader in some ways.
To some extent, yeah.
Yeah.
And as I said, it depends a lot on the personalities of the people involved.
Right. Somebody who has a lot of time. It's a good example.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have the ability and the expertise. So if you were comparing the climate today to what it was then, you'd say clearly that there's a lot more challenge now to try to attract the business, whereas then it was more just managing the success in some ways.
Yeah, well, when you think about the economy in general, it's
Yeah.
changed so radically. I mean,
Right.
we're now functioning in a global economy. Back then, it was much more segmented.
Was the airport a part of the attraction then as it would be now? I mean, was that as big a hub or was that less?
I think it was less so.
Okay.
To be honest, it's hard for me to partition and remember exactly when things happened.
These are
but,
challenging.
Yeah. Didn't tell me you were going to quiz me.
I'm coming at you, Dave.
But it was, I don't remember Bradley being a really vibrant economic generator at the time.
Right. It's just that today, so much of the discussion in economic development is our proximity
Right.
to the airport. That's a big selling point.
Yes.
Back then, it was more the draw of the manufacturing base of the area, probably.
That and certainly the expertise of the area.
Hmm.
And Hamilton was in Windsor Locks, as it is now, although it was probably more of a force at the time, so you had some spin-offs from that. And
Yeah, a lot of development probably was more reflective of the manufacturing base.
Yes.
I mean, they were
Yeah.
drawing off the demand from Pratt and other places. Okay, so you have, those are, we got to stop and back up just for a second. You have 4 children between your wife, Judy, and yourself have 4 children. Would you like to list their names for
Certainly.
for audience?
Michael, Stephen, David, and Jim
Okay.
are the 4.
All right. You passed that quiz. That would have been
I
bad.
did. That was, yeah.
So-
I have to crib for the next one.
And how old are you? How old are they?
That's the tough part. Let me think. Let me see now.
That's the last hard question.
The youngest is Jim, and he will turn 40 this year.
Okay.
The oldest is Mike, and I know. See, the problem is I have to go back to birth year and come back
Yeah, I
here
know,
again.
I know. We could.
Let's see. He will be 43 this year.
So the range
so they're
between
in-
40
they're
and
in between,
43.
yeah.
That's pretty tight. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so they were all in the same generation.
Yes.
wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
If so, jumping back into the town of East Granby, if you were
I misspoke. Jim is 37. I'm wrong. It's David who's turning 40 this year.
okay,
My
we had to get you on
apologies.
one day.
You did, yeah.
I wouldn't be a good sport if I didn't. If you had, your children are scattered through the country now.
They
aren't
are,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Where do they live?
Well, let's see. Mike is in Colorado.
Okay.
Steve's in Vermont. David is in Rocky Hill and Connecticut, and Jim is in New York City.
So you travel a lot.
We do.
To visit. Okay.
do.
And you have how many grandchildren?
A total of 7 so far.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're a busy guy.
Well,
Sometimes.
grandchildren are great, and you'll find this out at some point.
That's the easy part. Yeah, that's what everybody says. Okay, so getting back to East Granby, when you were involved in the Economic Development Commission, what was your next?
That's when I ran for Board of Finance
Okay.
and did not win.
Okay.
At that point, and then 2 years later ran for Board of Finance and did win.
Okay.
So that was.
What was back then? What were the challenges to the Board of Finance on a yearly basis, other than the budget issues? Was there any big development in town, or was there any particular large development projects that they were looking at? What was the focus of
There were a couple of development projects.
Okay.
We were in the process of putting together what's called a developer's agreement on the property that is east of the center, Connecticut South Drive, that area around.
What year was or what?
This was in the mid-'80s.
So you were looking at developing an industrial park.
Yes.
In town. Okay.
Yeah. And by what a developer's agreement does is that the town fronts the money for construction, let's say, of roads and other infrastructure.
Okay.
With the expectation, with the legal expectation, that there will be payback through taxes from increased development in that area.
So there's somewhat of a gamble there. But is it because you don't really see that as much anymore, the actual tracting of industrial parks.
Well, there's also, I should say, it's not that much of a gamble, because there's also a contract with the developer that after a certain period of time, let's say 5 years,
okay,
if the cost has not been recouped, the developer will make the town whole.
Oh, okay. So this is an agreement between a landowner,
Yes.
basically, and the town.
Yes.
So we'll put the roads in, but you owe us if it doesn't work.
Right.
Basically.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Because I know, like in places like Enfield and places, they actually took tracts of land and they didn't have that. I guess it was more. So this typically of East Granby was a fairly safe bet.
It was. Yeah. It was.
Okay. And what was anything about that was unique, or anything that
Well, I mean, certainly unique from my perspective,
Yeah.
that I'd never run across it before.
Right,
but,
right.
But that was one of the things that the Board of Finance gets involved in the sense that you're putting money up front, so there's capital expense involved.
Right.
At that point, we were also extending the sewers from really the Windsor border along Route 20 toward the center of town. So the sewer project, again, is one of those projects where the town puts money in up front and then assesses the properties that benefit from the sewers.
Okay. Which kind of ties into your new industrial.
Exactly,
park. Yeah.
exactly, and that was part of the whole process. And so that really was through the mid-'80s and into the beginning of the '90s, although the economic slump in the beginning of the '90s kind of took the air out of a lot of things.
Yeah, not dissimilar from what we're going through now, but not quite as extreme.
Not quite as extreme, yeah.
Okay, your tenure on the Board of Finance, other than that, were there any other large projects that you guys had to look at as a town?
Not so much projects. It was at that point that we began developing internally for the Board of Finance. We began developing what we now call the 5-year model.
So you started using that tool.
So we started using that tool
Okay.
to project what we would look like down the road if we took certain actions now, and we still use that as a planning tool today.
Was that kind of in vogue at the time? The other towns were taking that up, or was that something that, as the town of East Granby grew, in other words, were other towns doing that for a long period of time, and you incorporated it as the town grew and you felt you needed it, or was that something that was just kind of becoming new and
We plagiarized it from Granby,
Okay.
actually.
So
I don't know how long Granby had used it before we began to use that idea, that concept. But
Okay.
Granby had done that before we had, and we adopted the idea.
Okay.
And then subsequently, we've sort of branched off in a slightly different direction, in the sense that we're updating that on a more frequent basis than Granby does, let's say.
So they would actually come up with a template, a 5-year template, and kind of etch it in, not stone, but kind of try to work within that framework for 5 years, or they would?
Not. I think Granby has followed that more discreetly than we have.
Okay.
In East Granby. In Granby, I know when they've gone through major projects, what they've done is they've bought into a plan that carries them a certain number of years, whether that's 5 or 3, I'm not sure. But it defines what the maximum level of spending and maximum tax increase would be in each of the years that goes through the plan.
It's a little more of a commitment.
Yeah, it's more of a commitment. The Board of Finance in East Granby has used that more as a planning tool in the sense that we put numbers we populate the plan with numbers based on assumed growth in the grand list, what the tax rate might be over those years and so forth, but not so much that we tie ourselves into that, but we use that as a planning tool to say that if in this coming year we take some kind of action and we follow through with these assumptions that we have or these projections that we have in the rest of the model, what would the end of 5 years look like?
It's a way to give yourself a snapshot that's understandable.
Yes.
That you can actually look at and draw.
You try and put things in context so that you can make a decision with some basis.
So what did you do before that? Just go show up every year and say, this is what we got, this is what we might do? I mean, it was a little more...
It was a little more loose than it is today, as you can tell. But in the late 80s, the town was...
Check the checking account and see
see how much money we got. The late 80s, the town was growing very quickly. And as a result, the growth in the grand list really carried us through increments in town spending.
Right. So in 92 that the economy really crashed?
It was 91.
91, 92?
Yeah.
So you had to really get serious at that point and say, okay, what are we really doing here?
Yeah.
Okay. So what were the big capital projects then? I mean, you were on the front line of all this.
Well, let's see. The town center complex, really.
Okay.
At the time that we started, the town center consisted of what's now the ambulance building, what was then the firehouse, center firehouse, and the town hall. And the town purchased the land to the south, where the community center, community senior center, library, and the Rothammer Safety Complex are located.
Okay.
Purchased that and built those 2 buildings.
Right.
Excuse me, I added 3 buildings in there. The library obviously was much later, but the senior community center, the public safety complex were constructed at that point. That was early 90s.
Okay. Let me just stop you there for a second, because in that era, and you were talking about bonding or whatever you had to do for money for the industrial park, you had to guarantee that for a certain period of time, and now you start to really develop the town center. How popular and how much resistance was there to that? Because I know that isn't always popular. You know, I mean, the expenditures to that degree are often contentious. What was your sense then?
Not remarkably contentious. As a matter of fact, my memory of the community center was that the initial plan was smaller than the existing community center.
Okay.
And there was significant public pressure to increase the size because the folks who so it didn't come to a vote and get defeated. What had happened was during the public meetings where the building was discussed, the feedback said it's too small. You can't, there's no point in spending the money to build that when you can build this.
Let's spend more.
For a little bit more. Let's spend a little bit more money and get a better product for it.
Now, to be fair, I mean, that was after a period of fairly low tax increases?
Yes.
I mean, was that
actually a period of 2 or 3 years with no tax increases.
So they were feeling pretty flush at the time. You know, it's not costing us much to live here, and we want a better town. Okay, so if that was the case, where you were able to basically do what you wanted in that era. You had a plan and you presented it to the town. It was popularly accepted.
Well, I mean, the first selectmen did, and the Board of Selectmen did. We on the Board of Finance were we didn't have a lead role in that. We were simply the financial custodians to make sure that the financial ramifications of that were understood.
Interesting. So there was the political will was there at the selectmen's level, and the money was there because taxes were reasonable. Okay, that sort of transition fascinates me because there's always interesting points there. Okay, from there you went to the Board of Selectmen. You ran
for first selectman,
and you won your first race.
Won the first race, yeah.
And what was your experience running a race for first selectman in East Granby in that time? I mean, that's a fairly big race.
Yeah.
It's the top race.
Yeah.
What was it like?
It was very hard and a lot of fun at the same time. It was hard because my running mate Mary Ellen Brown and I walked the whole town. Right. Which meant that
what was she doing at the time?
She was the town assessor.
Okay, so
she was the assessor as she is now.
Was and is. Wow.
But she, what I would do, at that point I was working for the state. I was working for the Department of Economic Development for the state.
So you'd left Cigna?
I left Cigna. Actually, I got laid off from Cigna.
Really? Huh?
Yes.
During the crisis?
During they were very nice to me, but they pushed me out the door gently.
You were probably making too much. You get the
well, who knows? I don't think I was making too much.
Well, they
not
always
by, by today's standards.
Okay.
But I got laid off from Cigna and wound up working for the state in economic development.
Right.
And so I would leave that job at 4:30 in the afternoon and drive back to East Granby, and then Mary Ellen and I would walk for 2 or 3 hours in the evening.
Okay.
And we'd walk all day on Saturdays and Sundays. We did wind up getting to every house in East Granby.
Okay.
We may have missed one or two, I don't know, but
there's usually a few big dogs in the area.
You kind of run the other way. But and we had it was tough to get started every day. To walk, because you're saying to yourself, I really would like to relax.
And there's no guarantee at the other end either.
No. And so. But once you got rolling and got talking to people, it was just fascinating, because you get so many different perspectives.
Right.
You learn a tremendous amount talking to people, and people in East Granby were very receptive. I mean, they were extremely happy to have someone come to the door in most cases, not every case, but and there were a lot of houses where we left literature because people were away or whatever it may have been. But it was fascinating. Once you got the energy rolling, and so we'd walk on weekends. We'd start at about 10 in the morning and finish up around 5 or 6 in the evening.
And the two of you covered pretty much
covered
the whole
town. Yeah.
Well, that's great. So, what was the most unique experience walking around? Did you anything? Everybody has a story to tell.
Well, I remember at one point that we were walking on Newgate Road.
Okay.
And we went up to somebody's house, and it was kind of it wasn't a great day.
Right.
And Newgate Road's a very tough road to walk on.
There's a lot of long driveways.
Well, it's not so much the long driveways as it is that there's no shoulder. There's no shoulder. You can't pull off, and so but you don't want to drive to every house.
No.
So you park. Where you can find a place to pull off. Either you ask somebody if you can park in their driveway or something like this, and then you risk your life walking down the road.
It's a long walk.
So it was late in the campaign, so we were sometime latter part of October, and it was cool and windy, kind of threatening to rain, and we knocked on a door. And when there was a very pleasant woman who opened the door, and she said, "I've just baked a batch of pralines and they didn't turn out right. Come on in." So we went in. We sat there. I had I guess a cup of tea and some pralines or something. We got charged up to go back out. But we had several instances where people would invite us in. They would offer us something to drink or something like this, and you'd have a nice long conversation with people.
Yeah, that's where you learn a lot.
Yeah.
A very positive experience for you.
Absolutely.
Especially that day.
Yeah, that day was great.
Okay, so you run and you win.
Yeah.
And you and Mary Ellen show up. And who was your third member of the Board of Selectmen?
Dave Barnes.
Okay. So the three of you ran quite a long time together.
The three of us were a Board of Selectmen for 12 years together.
Yeah. Okay.
And Dave had been on the Board of Selectmen for 2 years prior to that. I believe 2 years, maybe 4. But so he was a selectman for 14 years at least.
Wow.
It was a fascinating experience. I mean, being first selectman was a challenging but fascinating job.
Right. Well, I'm going to run through a couple quick questions about that for you.
Okay.
What was the accomplishment you're most proud of as first selectman?
East Granby Farms.
Okay.
That was it was at the point when I came into office. It was owned by the Resolution Trust Company, because what had happened was a developer initially had come in and wanted to build something close to 500 houses on that land.
Wow.
He had acquired it for development purposes, and he wanted to build houses. He was a residential builder.
500. Wow.
Yeah, which would have entailed a tremendous amount of infrastructure, because a lot of that is ledge. So he was proposing to run sewer lines down to the center of town to hook into the sewers that we already had.
It would have radically changed the flavor of the town.
It would have been a remarkable change.
Yeah.
Over time, he had pared back his proposals, but in the meantime, he'd also gotten into financial difficulty.
Okay.
And it turned out the bank that he was working with got into financial difficulty. This was in a a time when banks were failing as well.
Right.
And so the property eventually percolated through the FDIC into Resolution Trust,
Okay.
and was owned by them at the time. I was alerted to the fact that they were planning on auctioning the property. And so I contacted the FDIC, and then working through Joe Lieberman's office, was able to get them to postpone the auction while we tried to negotiate a price that we could work out with them. Ultimately wound up negotiating a price with them. And so we purchased the property before it went to auction.
So the government worked with you on that. They said, okay.
They did. They had certain conditions. The primary condition they had was that it couldn't be used for anything other than a public purpose for 25 years. I think they were afraid at the time. They were being criticized for the handling. The FDIC was for the handling of some of the properties that they owned, and they were afraid we were going to buy the property and flip it and make a profit, and then all of a sudden they'd look foolish.
Yeah.
That wasn't our interest at all,
Obviously,
because
But they had to protect themselves.
They had to protect themselves, and I'd been looking for recreation land for a long time.
Right.
And because one of the things that when Mary Ellen and I first ran for office, we'd identified a series of things that people had said that we need in East Granby, one of which was more recreation space.
Okay.
So anyway, I got through, I was able to negotiate that through the FDIC, and ultimately with Board of Finance approval initially, and then ultimately with the town's approval, we were able to buy the property. And
that was a very popular vote too, wasn't it?
There were 202 people at the town meeting, and 200 people voted in favor of it, and 2 abstained.
Oh, did they? They didn't even vote against it. Oh, it's a classic.
Which I thought was fascinating. But and then at that point, the state was also offering open space grants.
Right.
So we subdivided the property. We took roughly, I think 410 acres about of the property.
Right.
And we segregated that, said we would not develop it. We'd leave it as open space, and we applied for an open space grant from the state and received that.
Oh, wow.
So right now, the property is divided. I mean, it's all one park, but you have 70 acres that can be developed for active recreation, play fields, what have you, and 410, give or take, that need to remain in their passive state. You can put trails across them and things like that, but you couldn't develop an athletic field on it.
That's got to feel great to have made that happen. I mean, that's a treasure for the town.
I love looking at that property now. And
well, we should mention that there is a building there that is called the David K. Kilbon.
David K. Kilbon, yes.
And that will be there as long as the land is.
I suppose. Yes. That's a very strange feeling, by the way.
Yeah, to see your name on it and be alive, right?
Yeah. I'm glad it doesn't say memorial.
No. We wouldn't be here. Anyway, so we have. So that was the accomplishment you were proudest of. Is there anything that you wish you could have accomplished?
Well, I would very much have liked to see East Granby adopt a charter.
Okay.
To run its operations, and I know that was. I mean, clearly from the vote that ultimately surfaced on that was not a popular thing. And,
right.
I think at the time,
at least not understood.
Well, it certainly wasn't popular for whatever reason.
Day, right, that's true.
And I look back on that and I think that maybe, I did a lousy job of explaining the details. I don't know. But,
well, you were used to 200 to 2 votes.
Yeah, that would have been a good vote, yeah. But anyway, obviously it didn't work.
Yeah.
And I still think that probably would be a wise thing for the town.
Right.
And I would suspect that at some point, down the road, that will happen. But,
regardless of the particular design or structure of that, you think we need to have a charter that we can maneuver our
I think a town benefits by having one. And the main reason I think that is that if you have a charter, you can define the way in which your town is going to operate.
Right.
If you don't have a charter, you're operating under state statute with the ability to put in place certain ordinances that the state allows you to do, and we've done that fairly successly. I mean, we've
worked within that framework.
We worked within that framework. I think it's much easier to work within a framework you define yourself. But
well, as first selectman, you would understand the need for that additional flexibility, and that's what you were working for.
Well, I mean, that was my opinion. Yes.
Yeah. So that was any other changes in town that you would like to have seen or would like to see come about in the near future? Well, why don't we turn this into our magic wand question? Okay, if you had a magic wand and could do one thing for the town of East Granby, and the the operating budget wasn't an issue, okay? Because you have your yearly commitment. But if there was one thing that you could do, what would it be?
Well, I'm an economic determinist, so taking the budget out of the picture is kind of hard to do.
Yeah, well, just make believe for a minute.
Yeah. I think there are several things we could do with town infrastructure.
Okay.
That we should be doing, or that we could be doing. I was very disappointed, for example, that we did not consolidate our elementary schools in one building.
Okay.
I think that would have been a wise move for us to do. And,
Right.
and obviously, again, that was something that went to a town vote, and folks in town didn't want to do that, so
Right.
that's okay. So I think that's one thing. I think that our town center complex is really a remarkable thing. If you look around at towns like East Granby, you just don't have that kind of a complex, and I think we could build on that. I think we did build on it by putting the library in the town center.
Right.
I think that's a real positive attribute for the community. But I think there are some infrastructure changes we may be able to make there. I think we could expand. In some way, we could build a dedicated senior center. I think that would be a positive thing for the town of East Granby. I think that there may be some floor space need in the town hall itself that we may need to address.
Okay.
So there are some changes there that I think if I could wave a magic wand, I'd probably do something
So
like that.
nothing really dramatic. You're talking
No.
more just expansion of what we have and enhancement.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think too that when I was first selectman, I was very much involved in the Capital Region Council of Governments,
Okay.
which is a voluntary regional agency that 30 communities belong to, and starting with the city of Hartford and then towns around Hartford.
Right. And you continue to.
Yeah, and I'm still involved with CROG. I think there are quite a few things you could do regionally that we do locally.
Okay.
Which means that we bear a heavy financial burden because we're a very small community.
Right.
I think that what we need to do is probably investigate some of those regional activities. I think, for example, there are some back office functions that could be done regionally or could be shared between the Board of Education and the town that we don't do for a variety of reasons. I mean, there are some certainly legitimate reasons to look strongly at not doing that.
Right.
But I think that we would be wise to investigate some of those things.
So work towards that.
Work
Yeah,
towards
yeah.
that, definitely. Certainly sharing between the town and the school. We do that on some occasions now, and there are probably some areas that we could expand on that.
Okay, if you were, because we could talk to you for 5 hours because of your experience, but is there anything else about that time or your time in East Granby, regardless of the era, that you want to share that is interesting?
Well, I think it's being first selectman is a fascinating job.
Right.
It's the only job I've ever had where every day is different.
Right.
And you really get a remarkable sense of what you're, what the community is thinking about.
Right.
Because you hear about that a lot. Obviously, you hear more from people who are discomfited by something than by people who are satisfied.
Right.
But you do get instant feedback.
Yeah.
There's a lot of lip service when you get up to the state level and you get up to the federal level. There's a lot of lip service about, local government is where where the rubber meets the road and so forth. But it's true. And, a lot of the folks at the state level, I think, are very happy not to be at that level because they don't get instant feedback.
Right.
But being...
you were in the pilot seat. You either had to, if you didn't do it, you had to answer why.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And in East Granby, one of the things that intrigued me too, because we worked very closely with towns around us, with Granby, Simsbury, and Windsor Locks. East Granby is small enough so that the job of first selectman in East Granby is very different from the job of East Granby and job of first selectman in let's say Simsbury.
Right.
In Simsbury, you've got a staff of 100 and some odd people.
Right.
You're really functioning as a manager of an operation. In East Granby, you've got about 20 to 25 full-time folks.
Right.
With various responsibilities, and you're certainly managing people in areas whose expertise you aren't that strong in. I mean, I would never pretend to know how to handle a public works operation nearly as well as Eddie Hubbard does, or a town engineer.
Right.
But you're also doing a lot of hands-on work.
Right.
And you're getting a lot of instant feedback from
Yeah.
folks as you're doing that hands-on work. And
So you can
that makes
actually
it
pick up the
fascinating.
ball and run with it.
Absolutely.
In a town like East
Yeah.
Granby. It's got to be, if you like that, it's
Yeah.
much more rewarding, I would think.
It's
Yeah.
very rewarding,
Yeah.
and it can be frustrating too.
Yeah.
But, and for me, the rewards outweighed the frustration, so that was great.
You can't blame somebody else if
No.
it goes wrong. You're the boss.
And that to me, that's very important.
Exactly, credibility.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you certainly have that credibility. You've been very well respected in town, and it's certainly a pleasure to have you here tonight. Well, one last question I'll ask you before we end, and I ask this of every guest: if you were to give advice to young people growing up today, what would that be?
Take the time to experience things that you want to experience.
Okay.
While you can.
Okay.
One of the things that I've been doing lately is I have this sort of it's not so much a dream as it is, because it's not real enough to be a dream.
Okay.
But I'm fascinated by the idea of hiking in the Appalachian Trail.
Doing the whole
thing,
route,
2,000 some odd miles.
Right.
And I think that would be, on the one hand, it'd be a blast. On the other hand, the more I read about it, the more I say, maybe not.
There's areas that are challenging.
But one of the books that I've read fairly recently is a book about a man who just quit his job when he was about 40
Okay.
and walked the trail. And as I thought about it, if you don't take time to smell the roses, if you spend so much of your time dedicated to either furthering your career or channeled into some areas that you really don't have an opportunity to do the things that you say to yourself, I really like to do that. If you don't make time to do those things, then I think ultimately you really regret it.
Okay.
And I'm not suggesting that
You just quit your job,
vast numbers
yeah.
of people just run away from reality.
Yeah.
But
It'd be tough to meet the budget.
But it would be tough to meet the budget. But I think it's important to indulge your interests, and to the extent you can, to the extent you have the flexibility to do that, or try and make the flexibility to do that,
Right.
that you need to.
Well, it sounds like you've done that in your life, and you're probably. I'm sure there's things you would have liked to do, but it sounds it's great advice, and I certainly wish you luck in pursuing that as you go on.
Yeah.
I think you're in a unique position that you're young enough to really continue to do a lot of those things in retirement.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating.
Absolutely.
All right, David. It was a pleasure having you here tonight, and once again, I'd like to thank you. And I would like to thank our guests for joining us here tonight with David K. Kilbon of East Granby. And we look forward to having other guests, and you can view us online at www.gctv16.org. It's a prompt that you can pull up, and you can view us weekly at our regularly scheduled times on Thursday and Friday night. We thank you for joining us, and have a nice evening.